Hey everybody, welcome back from the demo rooms, and I want to actually give a hand to everyone who presented a demo. Those were really awesome. It is fun to it's fun to walk around a room and just see what people are working on and hear them talk about their work. It's really inspiring and very just fun. It's fun. So our last keynote today is Michael Austin, who is the Provost and a professor of English at Newman University. He's the author of a number of books, one of which is Useful Fictions. Another one is called That's Not What They Meant, Reclaiming the Founding Fathers, and he does a lot of interesting work there. He's written more than 50 articles on all kinds of topics, including literature and history and other things. And he's very prolific, but more important than being prolific, he's actually very thought-provoking, which is why we invited him today. So welcome, Michael. Where did he go? There he is. Great.
If everything is working, the PowerPoint and the lav mic should now be magically, see? Oh, that is so cool. Okay, so I know we didn't organize this as a debate or a counterpoint, but I am going to be, I think, a little bit of a counterpoint to Kim Reese, who loves data and hates stories, because I love stories, and data, not so much. I was your typical liberal arts major in college. I went to college in 1984, fell in love with books, decided I never wanted to leave college, and never have. So I've just found increasingly advanced ways to get paid for talking about books and talking about ideas and talking about stories. I am an end user of many of the graphics that you create. I wouldn't know how to even begin. I've never had a stats class. I am bad at math. All of the stereotypes for English professors and university administrators pretty much hold true. I am, though, going to be stealing much of what I heard in the earlier sessions today. Right before I came, I was asked to come out Friday, so the day after I get back, to a Kansas Community College teachers technology workshop that I've been speaking at for 5 or 6 years, and I've said everything I know about technology. And so they asked me for a topic, and I was trying to get ready to go out of town, and I said, I will talk about storytelling with data. And with the thought that I would simply shamelessly steal things from all of you, which I have. And I've got them in my notes, and I'll try to remember who said what so I can make some sort of gesture towards you. But just so you know, I will be using many of the things that I learned today. It was fascinating. I am really glad that I came, and would have been glad even if I hadn't been speaking, maybe even a little gladder if I hadn't been speaking. But I do want to talk about a book I wrote about 6 years ago. And it's always perilous to talk about a book you wrote like 4 books ago, because I have a hard time sometimes remembering what I said. But this was a project that I spent 5 or 6 years working on. It actually resulted in two books. One, Useful Fictions, is just a sort of general explanation of the evolutionary foundations of storytelling. And one, which is called New Testaments, is an application of that to a whole bunch of poems that most people don't read anymore by Dryden and Milton and Bunyan and people like that. So I would like to just start with a question, which was the question that for about 5 years was the only thing I could think about in my spare time, because it was such a difficult question for me. And that is, why do human beings enjoy fictional stories? Why do we spend so much time, energy, money on movies and books and TV shows and plays and interactive video games, all of which tell stories that we know are not true? And it turns out this is a really hard question, one that there is not a lot of consensus about. And some aspects of the question are very easy, because we're into causation here, and we're into Aristotle and his 47 different causes. But in one sense, it's very easy to understand why human beings like stories so much, because they give us pleasure, right? Except that actually doesn't answer the question. That just restates it in a different way. Because the next question is, why are we the sorts of creatures who derive pleasure from stories? Especially fictional stories, stories that aren't true. What's the ultimate cause? The proximate cause is we like stories because we like stories. They're pleasurable. How I conceptualized this to myself when I first started thinking and writing about this was, why do human beings like anything? We like things because they give us pleasure. And it turns out that pleasure is evolution's bribe to get us to do things that have adaptive consequences. We are bribed with pleasure to eat certain kinds of food. We are bribed with pleasure to want to reproduce. We are bribed with pleasure to take great joy in the accomplishments of our offspring, because these are adaptive. These are things that help get our genes into the next generation. So why do we like sugar? And I have some pictures. I have to look at them. Why do we like sweet things? And really easy question. We like sweet things because sweet things give us pleasure, right? Except that that's really not a very good answer, because sweet things don't give us pleasure. What gives us pleasure is our taste buds, which are evolved organs of our body, and those organs evolved to produce favorable sensations upon certain stimuli. And what is it about what we call sweet that gives us pleasure? Well, that's actually not a very difficult question, but it's one that illustrates things very well. And do I have, okay, am I running out of batteries? No, okay. For 99.9% of the time that human beings were evolving as a species, sweet was equivalent to nutritious in fruit. If a fruit had nutrient value, then it was sweet, and if it was sweet, we liked it, it gave us pleasure, so there was an adaptive advantage to preferring sweet things. There was an adaptive advantage to deriving joy and pleasure from sweet foods. Now, that is no longer the case. If you look over here, that's sort of the result of our sweet tooth, and there's nothing particularly adaptive about a sugar baby. There's nothing particularly adaptive about cheesecake. What those are pleasure technologies. And they highlight one of the really most depressing things about human beings, and that is that we do not live in the world that we evolved to live in. We're like the deer in that way. You ever see a deer in the headlights? You've heard that expression. Deers go like this in the headlights. Why do deers go like this in the headlights? Why do they stay absolutely still? This is interactive, you can answer. Why do deer stay completely still? No, because the predators they evolved to evade can detect motion much better than they can actually see. So deer evolved to evade motion-detecting predators. So the best thing for a deer to do until about 150 years ago was stay completely still. Because the lions and the tigers and the cougars and the jaguars that hunted them, if they were absolutely still, could not see them. That does not work for the SUV. The deer, poor deer, and I used to live, before I moved to Kansas, I lived in West Virginia, where deer, just about everybody hit a deer. That was just a rite of passage in West Virginia. We hit deer because the car, the SUV, the station wagon, does not have that same kind of motion sensory. And the deer's million-year-old evolutionary strategy for avoiding predation was to stay absolutely still. It turns out to be the worst thing you can do with a car. The deer is not very well evolved to the world that the deer lives in today. We're pretty much the same way. We are evolved for what existed about 40,000 years ago. A Pleistocene savanna in hunter-gatherer groups of anywhere between 150 to 200. And we've spent several million years evolving to that point. And we've spent about 5,000 years not being that kind of people. And cultural evolution is Lamarckian. It builds on previous generations and it advances at a very rapid stage so that we now have a space-age culture and we have a Stone Age brain. That's why we like sugar babies, because sugar babies are sweet, and sweet used to mean ripe fruit. That's why we eat everything, or at least I do, everything that I see. That used to be a really adaptive way to approach food, because you never knew when you were going to get more of it, especially fat. Fat was good because it stored you for the winter. So it was very adaptive to eat everything you saw. And people who did that had a better chance of surviving. So many of us are just differently adapted to the world that we live in now. And there are all kinds of problems associated with that. But that brings up some just fascinating questions when we talk about storytelling. Because all human cultures tell stories. This is a human universal. There are a few things that we have observed everywhere we've looked. We find people telling stories. Most people derive a great deal of pleasure from stories, even when they know that they're not true. And people from all cultures, especially our own, expend just an insane amount of energy, attention, money that could be going for other things in order to consume fictional narratives. How much money is spent on movies, television, books, interactive video games? Trillions of dollars. And that's a real difficult question to answer. Daniel Dennett, anybody heard of Daniel Dennett? Really, really good philosopher of cognition, philosopher of evolution. His Consciousness Explained is a wonderful book, changed the way I thought about a lot of things. But he says in his book, Freedom Evolves, that when you come upon a pig rooting around looking for something to eat, you don't really need to wonder why the pig is spending energy looking around for food, because you know the pig needs food. But if the pig starts doing backflips, you have to come up with a good evolutionary explanation why. Because all activities are costly. We have a limited amount of all different kinds of resources. We have a limited amount of energy, a limited amount of time, attention, in our culture, a limited amount of money. And when we spend a huge portion of our resources for narratives that don't even contain truth, we need to, it's a very, very puzzling question. It's not hard to understand why we like narrative, because it's the way that we're built to think. You know, we think in stories. And by stories in the book, in Useful Fictions, I mean something very, very basic by stories. I mean information in sequence. That's all that I mean by a story. In a temporal sequence, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. In a spatial sequence, both of which ultimately get to a causation sequence. Because what sequencing information allows us to do, it allows us to do two things. One of them is, well, it allows us to do lots of things. Two important things that I want to talk about. It allows us to predict the trajectory. We want to predict what's going to happen. And it allows us to manipulate variables. What would happen if? I've been hunting and gathering, and my parents were hunting and gathering, and we've been hunting and gathering forever and ever and ever. What would happen if I put this little seed in the ground? Could I maybe stop hunting and gathering and become an agricultural person? You know, what would happen if I did this? What would happen if I combined this with this? And those, to an extent, are counterfactual narratives. They're not counterfactual in that we know them to be fictional. They're counterfactual in that they are not reality, or at least they are not yet reality. And that, it turns out, is fundamental to any kind of progress. You know, we're the only species that can conceive of counterfactuals. We're the only species that can imagine something that isn't the case. And that has huge implications. But it doesn't quite get us to why do we like stories that we know are completely made up, that we know are fictional. John Tooby and Lita Cosmatos, who are really the founders of evolutionary psychology, and they were at the University of California at Santa Barbara when I was there. That's where I got my doctoral degree. And I never talked to them then because I thought it was dumb. But afterwards, I remembered them and I read a number of their books, and I think they've gotten a lot smarter. But they say almost all of the phenomena that are central to the humanities are puzzling anomalies from an evolutionary perspective. Chief among these are the human attraction to fictional experience in all media and genres and other products of the imagination. This is a real problem. If you've read Steven Pinker, he brings this problem up in a number of places. It's a real problem. Daniel Dennett brings this up. Why, if we are a species that depends for our survival on information that is true, why do we expend such a tremendous portion of our resources producing and consuming information that is false and that we know to be false? And that's sort of the question that just kept me at this project because I couldn't figure it out. I did learn some very depressing things. And I want to talk about the two most depressing things that I learned in this process, which are still the two most depressing things that I know. I wish these weren't the case. I would like to change them, but I am convinced by a rather large amount of research that both of these are true. One, human reason did not evolve to find truth. We have enormous brains. By leaps and bounds, we have a tremendous cognitive architecture capable of doing things that no other species can do. But it's almost irrelevant to us whether or not we use that to find the truth. Our reasoning evolved to defend positions and to get resources, to manipulate other people into giving us what we need, to understand other people so we can know how to react to them. And anything that helps us do that is going to be adaptive. Take a look, if you want to sort of challenge the conception that human reason did not evolve to find truth but to defend positions, just read the comments of any news story. And what you will find are people in their natural state defending their positions and using their reason for exactly what we've been using our reason for 200,000 years, that is to attack people and defend our turf and impress girls. Or boys, exactly. But that's why antelopes have big horns. That's why humans have big brains. It's for interspecies combat. Okay? So that's the first most depressing thing that I know. We have huge brains that did not evolve to care about what's true. The second, and this is just a starting point for a lot of evolutionary research, is that natural selection doesn't particularly care if we're happy. Evolution is not there to produce happiness. It's there to produce people who survive and reproduce. And so it doesn't care if we get pleasure. It's not there to make us fulfilled or self-actualized. The whole process of natural selection really only cares about those two things. Now let me explain to you why this is important. And it has to do with what became the major focus of my research, and that is anxiety. Anybody here have anxiety? We all have anxiety. Anxiety is the most adaptive emotion, not just the most adaptive negative emotion. It's what triggers our limbic response. Anxiety is what just makes us either fight or flee. Anxiety is what makes us act. And we were designed for a world that was much more dangerous than the one we live in now. We were designed for a world in which we really did have to check at night and make sure there weren't any bears in the backyard. We were designed for a world where there were all sorts of things in the darkness that could kill us. So we were designed, and our anxiety-producing mechanisms were designed for a world that had a lot more danger than our world has. And even then, anxiety works on what's called the smoke detector principle, which is that anxiety encourages us to worry about things that aren't true. Because even a very small chance that something is going to be true is worth triggering our limbic response. Let me just give you an example. Here is my plasticine hunter-gatherer. His name is Thag. I use him in the book a lot to talk about just what's going on in the environment of our original evolution. So here is Thag, and I want to just give you a quiz. Assume that in Thag's world, 99% of noises behind rocks are made by harmless things, squirrels and mice and fluffy little critters that aren't going to be dangerous at all. And 1% are made by large, hungry tigers. So Thag hears a noise. What should Thag do under these assumptions? Should he stroll along and be cool Thag? Should he go over and investigate and find out which one it is? Or should he run away? What's his best response? To run away. Given what you know now, Thag's best response is to run. That means that 99 times out of 100, he will be running away from nothing. And the other 1% of the time, he will be saving his life. Right? Cool Thag, who just plays it cool, 99 times out of 100, he's going to be fine. The other 1% of the time, he's going to be dead. Same thing with curious Thag. If Thag investigates, 99 times he's going to find that there's nothing to worry about. One time is going to kill him. And the Thag who runs away 100 times, assuming he, in the course of his life, hears 100 noises, the Thag who runs away 1% of the time is going to survive, reproduce, pass on his scary little mammalian genes to the next generation, and thousands of generations of people who ran away from things produced us. And that's why we have too much anxiety. Now, anxiety is 3 separate systems. I'm going to put this here so I can look at it and know when I'm about to go over time. Anxiety is 3 separate systems. It's a behavioral system, and that is what you do if you walk around and pace and act anxious. Anxiety is a physiological system that just has to do with what chemicals are squirting into your brain. And anxiety is a cognitive system. That has to do with what you're thinking. And at any one of those points, anxiety can start and affect the other 2. So if I start acting anxious, I will become anxious. And then I will think anxious thoughts. And because I don't have anything to be anxious about, my mind will invent something to think about. We call that OCD. Everybody in my family has OCD. There are 4 of us. Not one of us got cleaning. Can you believe that? Hand washing and hoarding and all organizing. So what's the use of 4 OCD people who can't clean? If you alter the chemicals in your brain, you can alter your behavior and your cognition. That's why Zoloft works. I can testify that Zoloft works. And you can both create anxiety in the other 2 systems and neutralize that anxiety by telling yourself a story. And that was the observation that once I came upon that, that's the observation upon which the book Useful Fictions is built. That stories can both produce and neutralize anxiety, which from an evolutionary perspective is the most important emotion that we have. Now, what kind of story? Because when Thag hears this rustle, he's going to tell himself a story. What kind of story is going to be the most adaptive kind of story for Thag? Yeah. 3 things are going to help Thag tell himself a story that will be adaptive. They are not going to make him happy. They're going to make him a nervous, little neurotic creature. But evolution doesn't care. Thag is going to tell himself an exaggerated story. He's going to exaggerate what it might be because the cost of overstating a danger is always less than the cost of understating a danger. It's going to be an exciting story because he needs adrenaline, because that's what's going to help him get back to camp. And it needs to be speculative, because he can't investigate. If he investigates, he will die 1% of the time. So what Thag has to do at the very beginning, I'm trying to go back to the very beginning of narrative. What Thag has to do is tell himself an exciting, exaggerated, speculative story. How many of our human stories are exaggerated, exciting, and speculative? Quite a few. I mean, you look at the early stories, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Ramayana. You look at the early stories in human culture, they are exaggerated, exciting, and speculative. You look at what's on TV most of the time, and I don't know. I haven't watched TV in 15 years. That's how I've been able to write books. But my children tell me that things on TV are exciting and speculative and exaggerated. This is how we build our narratives. And what I'm arguing is that we build our narratives this way because if you trace it back to why narrative evolves in the human species, it's in order to do things where the narrative needs to be exaggerated, exciting, and speculative. So successful narratives, and this is where I hope I can intersect a little bit with what you're doing here, with how do you frame stories. Successful narratives are those that introduce and then resolve anxiety. They have to introduce anxiety to get our attention. They have to resolve our anxiety because we just can't be that anxious all the time. Once we feel anxious, it's so unpalatable to us, we'll do anything to try to resolve that anxiety, including telling ourselves stories. Now, does it matter if the story is true? If you're telling yourself a story to resolve your anxiety, it doesn't matter if it's true. How I define a useful fiction in the book, it's not something that is not true. It's something where the adaptive or the evolutionary value of the narrative does not depend on it being true. There are stories, if Thag is lying asleep at night before a big hunt and he hears a noise and the noise wakes him up, well, what does the narrative that he tells himself have to do in order to be adaptive? Yeah, he just can't stay. If he stays awake, he's not going to survive. So he needs to tell himself a comforting story that will reassure him and let him go back to sleep. Ah, that noise. It was a bird. Because that'll let him go back to sleep. Even if it was something really scary, in this case, all the narrative has to do to be useful is get him back to sleep. It doesn't matter if it's true, because the purpose of the narrative is not to find truth. It's to produce some consequence that is going to be adaptive, that is going to help him hunt or gather or mate. And that's what that's what people lie most about, is hunting and gathering and mating, right? Because those are things where if it furthers your evolutionary interests, truth is really irrelevant. So what causes anxiety? And here are a few things that I just want to talk about, and I hope we'll have a little time for questions later, but a few things that cause a lot of anxiety in us. And I'm going back to the 40,000 years ago us, because that's what matters when we talk about our minds, what our minds were evolved to do. Many of the things that we do now are things that we learn. And we learn a lot of things in school. Statistics is one of them. There was no statistics in the wild when we evolved. And we're actually very bad. We're very bad natural statisticians. Those of you who've become good at it do so at some cost, because naturally we are very easy to fool with statistics, because precision takes a lot of energy, and all we really need is good enough in order to survive. So we get a lot of anxiety about things that are going to eat us or threaten our safety. That's why a narrative on gun violence is going to be so powerful, because it produces a threat, and threats introduce a lot of anxiety. People introduce a lot of anxiety to us. We evolved in groups of 150 to 200 people, and our survival depended on our being able to figure out what all of them were thinking, what they were going to do, to predict, to try to manipulate. Puzzles that we can't solve. we will keep going until we solve them. And I'm going to go down with the fictional equivalents of each of these, but these are just some things that really make us anxious. Incomplete things, we are really designed to finish tasks. Anybody ever heard of Bluma Zygarnik? She was a Soviet psychologist who studied waiters in restaurants and discovered that waiters could remember almost everything that somebody ordered until the bill was paid, and then they forgot everything. And she built quite a good, this was in the 20s, but she built a pretty good body of work on what's now called the Zygarnik effect, which is that we pay a lot of attention to tasks that are open. When we hit the closure, then we stop paying attention. And finally, things that are unknown. And I want to talk about each of these and how it relates to narrative. But first, I want to talk about our very first fiction. How many of you have children? How many of you play the game that I played with? I have two children. One is 17, one is 13. We don't play this game anymore. But we used to play a game, and I bet some of you did too. The name of the game is I'm Going to Get You and Eat You Up. How many of you have ever played I'm Going to Get You and Eat You Up? Okay, so you know how you play. You get down on all fours, and you say, I'm going to get you and eat you up. And what does the child do? Screams in delight. Why aren't they saying, oh my God, my father is a homicidal maniac. I am not safe here. I need to get out. But no, the child is happy. What does that tell you? Pardon me? Okay. It tells you that at 18 months old, a child can tell the difference between fictional danger and real danger. This is and a psychologist named Alan Leslie has done an enormous amount of work with infant chase play. This is the beginning of the human ability to tell the difference between fact and fiction. And it turns out that we're not the only animal that does this. All primates and about half of mammal species engage in some kind of chase play with their young because it's good training. You know, chase play evolves. You all play the game. Everybody plays the game. It's another human universal, chase play with infants. It does two things. First of all, it trains children to hide from predators. So it's a training exercise. Secondly, it reassures children that they can hide from predators because, you never actually get them and eat them up. They always get out of it okay. So these are the two things that our very first fictional narratives are designed to do. To provide training in tasks that are adaptive and to provide reassurance that can neutralize our anxiety. So keep those two things in mind as I talk about the different kinds of fiction that evolve out of these very basic primal tasks. I would say that a good half of the literature that's ever been written in the world is about people getting eaten by something. This is, if you look at the Odyssey, there are several creatures in the Odyssey that want to eat Odysseus, but the Polyphemus, the Cyclops, is the most obvious, who just sort of picks people up and starts eating them. And what does Odysseus say to Polyphemus? He says, how dare you do that? That is against Greek law, you damned eater of guests. Because he just can't believe it. But Ravana in the Ramayana is this 10-headed demon who eats people. Dragons, throughout the Middle Ages, dragons are always eating people. The Minotaur is eating people in the maze, and that's why Theseus has to come to their defense. Zombie stories and vampire stories and all of the various monsters and aliens. An enormous amount of the literature of human beings revolves around their being eaten. Why? Because that's the most basic primal fear that we have. that just reaches in. If you want to reach into somebody's reptilian, mammalian brain and just grab them, show them in some sense being the subject of predation. How long has it been since human beings have actually had predators? I mean, here and there you see a shark, but basically, human beings have been without predators for at least 10,000 years. But that's a very short amount of time in evolution. And so we are evolved for a world 200,000 years ago when we were a fairly defenseless, tasty species and had lots of predators. So our psychological mechanisms, our cognitive architecture is always this far away from thinking that something's going to eat us. And that makes wonderful narratives. When I was in high school, Jaws was the most important movie. A shark eating people. Now it's zombies eating. What do zombies eat? They eat brains, right? You don't know? Okay, brains. Yeah, okay. So predation narratives, or narratives of not just danger, but of a primal danger, get our attention very quickly, and the stories do two things. They allow us to practice evading predators. Probably the movie in my life that I have seen that has had the biggest impact on me, the one that has scared me the most and made me think the most. I was 17 when I saw this movie on TV. It was Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. Anybody ever seen that movie? If you were like me, I lay up in bed for weeks thinking of ways to bird-proof my house. I mean, I lay there thinking, okay, I could do this, I could do this. Now, I have never had to bird-proof my house, but it's also helped with insulation and things. I mean, I have really thought about what can get into a house. It allowed me to practice. Now, that one didn't give me very much reassurance because, everyone dies at the end of it, and basically the world is over. But most narratives, like Dracula, end with human ingenuity overcoming the predator. So the two things, it lets me practice the skills mentally that actually can be useful in some environments, and it lets me feel the sort of relief at the end when I see that my human cognitive brain power can overcome Mr. Bad Vampire until they need a sequel. So that's one class of narratives. Another huge class of narratives, and Jane Austen is probably the best example of this, is the narrative of complicated social situations. Books, novels of manners. And these are hugely important because, as I said, we're not quite sure what environment human beings were adapted to, except that we're adapted to each other. Our cognitive architecture, what drove our cognitive evolution, and in a very small amount of time, evolutionarily speaking, about 200,000 years, we went from being basically apes to modern, cognitively sophisticated human beings. That was a huge cognitive evolution that was precipitated by the fact that we were in these groups and we had to figure other people out. Because the most expensive cognitive thing that we do is try to figure other people out. If I'm in a group of 200 people, I need to be able to predict what each one of them is going to do. I need to understand how all of them are related to everybody else. I need to try to understand what makes them tick. And that is an enormously complicated cognitive task. It's like I remember when I was in college and the computer for the first time beat Garry Kasparov. I think it was Deep Fritz that beat Kasparov. And I was like, oh, big deal. The computer can beat him in chess. Let's see the computer go to middle school. Let's see the computer at recess, because that's what is the most cognitively challenging thing that we do. It has nothing to do with playing chess. That's just a mathematical exercise. Just get 30 kids together and play on the jungle gym. See if Deep Fritz can do that. Then I'll believe in artificial intelligence. So an enormous amount of our fiction lets us practice reading other people, like Mr. Darcy, like Elizabeth Bennet, like Tom Jones. This is another kind of narrative that gives us great pleasure because it's practicing something that causes us enormous anxiety, which is other people, And it's reassuring us at the end that things will go well. Mr. Darcy will ask again. Third kind of narrative that is really, really important and has become probably the best-selling kind of literature of the 20th and 21st century. These are narratives of detection. These are narratives of problem solving, where the author creates a problem and invites us to solve the problem. This is the mystery novel more than anything else. This is crucial because this is where we get a lot of our practice. You know, for literature to be adaptive, it has to give us practice doing useful things. And even though locked room murders are not going to pop up in most of our lives, puzzles that require us to fit pieces together and anticipate behavior are. So the narrative of detection, and this goes back a very, very long time. Anybody know the first detective story in literature, by the way? Anybody know what it is? It's the story of Susanna in the Hebrew Bible, what Protestants call the Apocrypha, where Daniel has to decide whether or not Susanna tried to seduce these two men who actually tried to rape her. And they say that she tried to seduce them and they're going to kill her. So what he does, they said that she tried to seduce them under a tree. What he does is he takes the two people to different ends of the courtyard and asks them which tree. And it turns out they give the wrong answer. So they die and she doesn't. And that's our first detective novel, kind of. So those are three kinds of narratives that overwhelmingly define the kind of literature that attracts us. The predation narrative, the novel of human society, and the novel of problem solving. We are also this is the Zeigarnik effect that I was talking about. We are very, very, very influenced by cliffhangers. Probably none of you remember The Perils of Pauline. I don't even remember The Perils of Pauline. This was a silent movie serial. They showed it before the main features. And every episode, Pauline would be, at the very end, tied to the railroad tracks or falling out of an airplane or being eaten by a goat or something. And you'd have to come back to see. And amazing, the psychological effect here, based on incomplete information. This is why nobody ever has a count up. You never had Casey Kasem counting up to number 40. He's always counting down to number 1 because he knows, well, he's dead, but he knew that you'll stay on the radio to see what number 1 is. And if he gives you that at the beginning, you're not going to stay to see what number 40 is. So the narratives, when we build narratives that produce anxiety, the cliffhanger is one of the most important ways that narrative builders produce anxiety. Really great novelists will keep asking and answering questions. They'll raise issues, they'll produce that anxiety, and then they'll satisfy it, but at the same time, they'll open up another question. That's how really great stories work. And finally, we are deeply, deeply attractive to stories about things that are unknown. Because once we tell a story about them, they're not unknown anymore. And that is a very, very comforting thing because we are creatures who, at one point, the dark was a really scary thing. Most people are afraid of the dark for good reasons. And that is that in the environment that we evolved for, dark was when all the bad stuff happened. It's when you got eaten. So we love narratives about things that we don't know anything about. We like discovering something we didn't know anything about. So the narrative, the successful narrative, first tells you something you didn't even know you didn't know. And then it satisfies that anxiety. So, what gives us pleasure in a narrative? Exercising our cognitive muscles gives us pleasure. Just the same way I've heard some people get pleasure from jogging and exercising. I don't understand those people, but my understanding is that there are people for whom exercising their physical body gives great pleasure. It's the same thing with our minds. We derive pleasure exercising because we're exercising adaptive things. Solving puzzles gives us great pleasure. When a narrative interjects and then resolves a puzzle, or allows us to resolve a puzzle, that produces pleasure. Giving us the perception of competence. And this is another one of those things that actual competence is less important than the perception of competence. It is very adaptive to think you know what's going on, even more than to actually know what's going on, because decisive action is adaptive. So a narrative that makes people think they know something is going to be very, very pleasure-producing, because the confidence gained with such narratives is very, very adaptive. Narratives that complete a picture. When we see a picture, when you see a puzzle with one or two pieces missing, you just get really anxious about it, and when you finally finish the puzzle, you go, ah. So narratives that complete a picture are going to produce a lot of pleasure. And finally, narratives that demystify the unknown. In the century that I study professionally, which is the 17th century, this was the travel narrative. The story of the person who goes to a deserted island or an island inhabited by savages and explains it to you. That demystifies, because the unknown is always anxiety-producing. So narratives that allow you to know what was previously unknown are going to produce pleasure, because they are very adaptive. And I think I am now at the end, so I'll be glad to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
Hi. First off, really interesting talk. I really loved it. I have some questions about risk. So
Okay.
it seems like in childhood, we encourage children to avoid risk, right? We teach them about this chase play. We tell them don't walk around outside at night, don't talk to strangers too much. And then at a certain point, that advice flips. And for grown-ups, we encourage them to embrace risk. And there's this whole cultural narrative about how risk is a good thing. And then there also seems to be a certain percentage of people, both children and adults, who seem to really embrace risk. And they're adrenaline junkies, and they jump off buildings and start businesses and do all kinds of crazy things. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that weird cultural narrative around risk.
That's a really, really good question. Thank you for that question, because it gets to the heart of some very important things. First of all, we are spectacularly bad at evaluating risk. We are really bad at it. When in situations, we always overestimate our abilities. We think that some things are really, really dangerous that aren't really, really dangerous. Ebola, for example. How many people in America died of Ebola? I think 3. The same time, 500 people died of swimming pools. But you ask anybody, what's more dangerous, Ebola or swimming pools, they will say Ebola. So we're not good risk evaluators. Taking risks can be very, very adaptive, because there's some risks usually come with really big payoffs. So taking risks can be adaptive. Not understanding what's really at risk is very important, because most of us, if we actually evaluated the risk correctly, would not take it. So there's sort of an adaptive ability to doing stupid things that pay off. So as to why do we teach children to avoid risks? Because the risks are very real that we're teaching our children to avoid. I mean, there is a difference between jumping off of a building and starting a business. One of them is going to possibly kill you. The other one, it's risky, but it's risky in a different way. So I think that, that we teach children to be very careful about physical risks, because those are deeply problematic for our survival. Now, some people do love to take risks, and they love the adrenaline. That's a pleasure technology. That's just a drug. We can produce adrenaline now in very safe ways. We can look at tigers in the zoo, and they're scary, and we get that adrenaline rush. We can jump out of an airplane and have a parachute. That's a much safer thing than jumping from a tall place would have been 40,000 years ago. So those are pleasure technologies like sugar babies that allow us to experience the pleasure of that adrenaline rush in a much safer environment. So I think as to why, and I'm not sure I have a good answer for the question of why do we teach children to avoid risk and then teach them to embrace it, except that normally we're teaching children to avoid physical risks and we're telling people to take emotional and financial risks. Rarely do we tell people they should go play in traffic at any age. I mean, there are a couple of people that I have told that to, but it was not out of love or devotion to them. You know, it's like, it's never a good idea to run with scissors, but it might be a good idea to go skydiving because our technologies are at the point where we can control the danger now. So, yes.
As a follow-along to that question, you said as adults we are telling people to take emotional and financial risks. If we bring it back to natural selection, in the case of many people when they take emotional or financial risks, depending on their situation, depending on the country they're in, it may sink their ability to reproduce for the rest of their lifetime. How do you address that?
That's a really important cultural question because there are some cultures in which taking risks will influence your ability to reproduce. There are many cultures, though, in which not taking risks will influence your ability to reproduce. So emotionally, people are, in many cultures, going to do better if they take some risks emotionally than if they were always safe in the reproduction aspect of things. Evolution is not capable of preparing us for multiple cultures at the same time. We have a brain that was adapted to a particular environment, and then a lot of what we call culture is trying to override some of those commands. And so in some cultures, people are going to be warned away from certain types of risks for culturally specific reasons. Does that kind of answer the question? Right. Culture evolves along Lamarckian lines. Physical and cognitive capacities evolve along Darwinian lines, and that means there's going to be huge differences because Lamarckian evolution is a much faster process.
Other questions? Over there.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I just had a quick question about your slides and the old guy with the brain pet in the corner.
That was Darwin.
Oh.
That was Darwin holding a brain.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll go back. That was, yeah. Oh, that's not going to work. Oh, well, it's gone. But yeah, that was Darwin. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
If nothing else, I prove to you I am not a designer.
Well, thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much.